Number 1. Sean Hornbeck. Sean Hornbeck was born on January 15, 1991, in Richwoods, Missouri. He grew up in a small, close-knit town in Washington County, the kind of place where children still rode their bicycles to friends' houses on Sunday afternoons without drawing any concern from their parents. He lived with his mother, Pam Akers, his stepfather, Craig Akers, and his siblings. By every measure, he was a typical, cheerful 11-year-old boy. On October 6, 2002, Sean got on his bicycle and set off toward a friend's house. He never arrived. He never came home. Within hours, his family reported him missing. The search that followed was immediate and wide-ranging. Volunteers, law enforcement, and community members thoroughly covered the surrounding area. But there were no witnesses, no confirmed sightings, no trail that led to anything meaningful. The case went cold with a speed that was devastating for everyone involved. Michael John Devlin was 33 years old at the time of the abduction. He managed a pizza restaurant called Emo's Pizza in Kirkwood, Missouri. He paid his rent without issue. He had neighbors who were familiar with him, and co-workers who interacted with him on a daily basis. He had no criminal record, no prior history that would have triggered any alarm within any system, and no visible indicators that would have prompted a second look from anyone. That outward ordinariness was not incidental. It was the precise mechanism through which he operated for years without attracting suspicion. On that Sunday afternoon in October, Devlin struck Sean's bicycle with his white pickup truck. He then approached the fallen boy. There had been no prior contact, no extended grooming period, no existing relationship to exploit, only a calculated act of opportunity taken in a quiet location where no one happened to be present. And then Sean was gone. The early phase of captivity was characterized by extreme and deliberate control. Devlin employed restraints, isolation, and targeted physical harm to establish dominance from the very beginning. He made the consequences of resistance unmistakably clear from the outset. The process of breaking Sean down was not achieved through a single act. It was carried out through sustained and methodical psychological pressure, designed to eliminate any capacity for resistance before it could take root. Over time, however, the conditions began to change, and this is where the psychology of prolonged captivity becomes particularly difficult to comprehend. Devlin gradually relaxed certain restrictions. He gave Sean a new name, Sean Devlin. He provided him with internet access and a cell phone. He permitted limited movement and limited contact with the outside world. From the outside, and at a distance, it bore a superficial resemblance to a normal existence. It was not freedom. It was a considerably more sophisticated form of control. When captivity becomes the only reality a person has known, when an entire life has been constructed around a single captor, the mind begins to adapt. Not by choice, but because adaptation is the only available means of survival. The boundary between captor and confinement begins to dissolve. The outside world grows increasingly abstract, remote, and almost impossible to envision as reachable. The act of leaving ceases to feel like an option and begins to feel like something the mind can no longer fully conceive. One of the most sobering details of this case is what Sean did during those years while online. He visited his own missing persons page. He read through the posts left by people who were actively searching for him. And at one point, he left a comment on that very page, asking how long the search would continue. Consider that for a moment. A child living under a false identity in his captor's apartment with internet access and a cell phone, reaching out to the community looking for him, not to call for help, but to ask when they intended to stop. That single detail conveys what 4 years of prolonged captivity does to a human mind more precisely than any clinical account ever could. The case was not resolved through an investigative breakthrough linked to Sean. It unraveled because Michael Devlin could not restrain himself. On January 8, 2007, Devlin abducted a second child, 13-year-old Ben Ownby, from a bus stop in Franklin County, Missouri, a different county from where Sean had been taken. On this occasion, a witness caught a partial description of the vehicle: a white pickup truck. That detail circulated among investigators and led them to Devlin's apartment at 4 Concordia Court in Kirkwood, Missouri. On January 12, 2007, police knocked on the door. They found both boys alive. Sean Hornbeck had been missing for 4 years, 3 months, and 6 days. The rescue took minutes. The legal proceedings took longer, but left no uncertainty about the outcome. Devlin faced charges at both the state and federal level, including kidnapping, forcible sodomy, attempted murder, and additional counts related to Ben Ownby's abduction. The sentences handed down were significant in their scope. In the Missouri proceedings alone, Devlin received multiple life terms. In total, he was sentenced to 74 life sentences, plus an additional 1,175 years, ensuring that he would never be released under any conceivable legal scenario. In the period following the rescue, certain members of the public raised deeply problematic and unjust questions about why Sean had not attempted to escape during 4 years of captivity, particularly given that he had access to a phone and the internet, and at times moved with some degree of limited freedom. Those questions reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of coercive control and the psychological framework of prolonged captivity. Law enforcement, child advocacy professionals, and mental health specialists were unanimous and unequivocal in their response. Sean was a victim. The full weight of responsibility for every moment of those 4 years rested entirely with Michael Devlin. Sean's life following the rescue was kept deliberately and entirely private, a choice that deserves complete and unconditional respect. Recovery from 4 years of captivity, from the physical, psychological, and developmental harm inflicted upon him, is not something that unfolds in a press conference or a news segment. It is a prolonged, non-linear, and deeply personal process that belongs solely to him. He was reunited with his family. He was home. His stepfather, Craig Akers, who had spent 4 years as one of the most publicly recognized faces of the search effort, never once gave up, not for a single day. Ben Ownby, the second boy found in Devlin's apartment, was recovered just 4 days after his abduction and had not suffered lasting physical harm. He was reunited with his family within days of the rescue and has since maintained a private life. Devlin, now in his late 50s, is serving his sentences at the Potosi Correctional Center in Missouri. He will remain there for the rest of his life. The boy he attempted to erase made it home. The man who took him never will. But the next case is different. The next victim was taken by someone who had already been inside her home, someone her family had trusted and welcomed through their front door. And there were moments, agonizingly close moments, where she was almost found. Almost. That word will stay with you long after this story ends. Michelle Knight was born on April 23, 1981, in Cleveland, Ohio. She grew up facing considerable hardship, and by the time she disappeared, she was a young mother managing a difficult home situation. Amanda Berry was born on April 22, 1986, also in Cleveland. She was bright, personable, and worked part-time at a Burger King near her home. Georgina de Jesus, known to those around her as Gina, was born on February 13, 1990, in Cleveland. She was 14 years old, widely regarded in her neighborhood as warm and outgoing, with a broad circle of friends. 3 young women, 3 separate lives, 3 separate disappearances, all from the same city, all taken by the same man. Ariel Castro was 42 years old when he abducted the first of them. He was a school bus driver for the Cleveland Metropolitan School District, a man entrusted daily with the safety of other people's children. He resided at 2207 Seymour Avenue in a working-class neighborhood on the west side of Cleveland. He was recognized in the area. He was visible. He attended neighborhood gatherings. To most of the people around him, he was simply a neighbor. Michelle Knight was 20 years old when she vanished in August 2002. She had gone to Castro's house in search of his daughter, a former classmate, hoping she might be able to assist with a custody matter involving Michelle's own son. She walked through the front door and never came back out. When her family reported her missing, investigators initially treated the case as low priority. She was an adult. She had a complicated home life. She did not fit the profile that typically generated urgent public attention. Within 15 months, she had been removed from the missing persons database and categorized as a runaway. That decision effectively eliminated her from active search efforts and remains one of the most heavily criticized failures associated with this entire case. A real woman, in genuine danger, erased from the very system that was designed to locate her. Amanda Berry was 16 years old when she disappeared in April 2003, the day before her 17th birthday. She had completed her shift at the Burger King on Lorraine Avenue and phoned her sister from a nearby payphone, saying she had arranged a ride home. That was the last contact anyone had with her for a decade. Her case attracted considerably more media coverage than Michelle's had. She was younger. Her disappearance aligned with a more recognizable profile. Her image appeared on flyers, on television, and in newspapers. Her mother, Luana Miller, appeared on the Montel Williams show in 2004, where a psychic informed her that Amanda was no longer alive. Luana Miller died of heart failure in March 2006, never learning that her daughter was alive less than 4 miles from their home. Gina de Jesus was 14 years old when she vanished in April 2004. She was a friend of Castro's daughter, Arlene. On the afternoon she disappeared, Castro offered her a ride home from school. She accepted because she knew him, because her family knew him, because he was a neighbor, the father of her friend, and there was no discernible reason to regard him with any suspicion. She was never seen outside that house again. 3 women, 2 years, 1 address. Inside 2207 Seymour Avenue, Castro had assembled a hidden and controlled environment. Doors had been reinforced with multiple locks. Windows were boarded from within. Alarms had been installed to alert him whenever a door was opened. The women were kept in separate rooms, isolated from one another for extended periods, unable to develop the kind of sustained connection that might have strengthened their ability to resist. Control was maintained through deprivation, psychological manipulation, and the constant and immediate threat of violence. He dictated when they ate, when they slept, when they could use the bathroom, and when they were permitted to speak. Every element of every day was governed by one man's absolute authority over 3 human lives. What makes this case especially difficult to reckon with is the duration. This was not a matter of days, weeks, or even months. It spanned nearly a decade. 10 years of ordinary life unfolding on the outside of that house. Neighbors tending their lawns, children playing in the street, people walking past on their way to work, garbage trucks arriving each week, mail being delivered to the door, life continuing in every direction, while 3 women endured what was happening inside, just beyond those boarded windows. There were moments when others came close to discovering the truth. Neighbors had noted things over the years: covered windows, unusual sounds at odd hours, a backyard that appeared unusually enclosed. Complaints had been made, but nothing was ever connected in a way that produced a formal investigation. In retrospect, indicators were present. But retrospect is not available in real time, and the people who walked past that house each day had no framework for imagining what existed inside it. Amanda Berry gave birth to a daughter, Jocelyn, on Christmas Day, 2006. The delivery took place inside the house without any medical assistance, with Michelle Knight helping to bring the baby into the world under conditions no person should ever be placed in.
Jocelyn was born into captivity and spent the first 6 years of her life within those walls. On May 6, 2013, Castro left a door unlocked. It was an error he had not made in 10 years of meticulous and deliberate control. Amanda Berry recognized the opportunity and acted without hesitation. She forced open the interior door and called out for help through the outer storm door. A neighbor, Charles Ramsey, heard her and ran across the street. He helped force out the lower panel of the door. Amanda crawled through with 6-year-old Jocelyn in her arms and ran to a neighboring residence to call 911. That 911 recording became one of the most widely recognized in modern true crime history. Her voice strained, she said, "Help me! I'm Amanda Berry. I've been kidnapped, and I've been missing for 10 years." The dispatcher asked her to repeat herself. She did. Police arrived within minutes. Officers entered the house and found Michelle Knight inside. She threw herself into an officer's arms and held on, repeating over and over that they had saved her. Gina de Jesus was located shortly after. Within hours, all 3 women were free. The legal proceedings moved with uncommon speed. Castro was indicted on 977 counts and entered a guilty plea to 937 of them, including kidnapping, rape, and aggravated murder charges related to forced miscarriages, in order to avoid the death penalty. On August 1, 2013, Judge Michael Russo sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 1,000 years. In the courtroom, Castro told the judge he was not a monster, that he was a sick person, and that the house on Seymour Avenue had in fact been a place of happiness. Michelle Knight stood in that same courtroom and responded to him directly. She told him she had spent 11 years in conditions no person should endure, and that his own ordeal was only just beginning. She told him she had known pain and grief every single day, and that she refused to allow what he had done to define the rest of her life. 33 days into his sentence, on September 3, 2013, Ariel Castro was found dead in his cell at the Correctional Reception Center in Orient, Ohio. His death was ruled a suicide. For the survivors, that outcome carried a complexity that is entirely understandable. There would be no extended trial, no prolonged courtroom confrontations, no sustained public process of accountability. He removed himself from it entirely, and in doing so, denied them something they had every right to pursue. The house at 2207 Seymour Avenue was demolished on August 7, 2013, at the request of the survivors and the surrounding community. The lot where it once stood remains vacant. Michelle Knight legally changed her name to Lily Rose Lee. She married Miguel Rodriguez on May 6, 2016, the exact 3rd anniversary of the day she walked out of that house. She founded Lily's Ray of Hope, an advocacy organization supporting survivors of abuse, and has spoken publicly about her experiences with remarkable resolve. Amanda Berry co-authored a book titled Hope with Gina De Jesus and has largely withdrawn from public life, focusing on raising her daughter Jocelyn, who is described as healthy, resilient, and flourishing. Gina De Jesus co-founded the Cleveland Family Center for Missing Children and Adults in 2018, situated deliberately near Seymour Avenue, transforming the location associated with her trauma into a resource for others in need. Their paths to recovery, like their experiences, belong entirely to them. What this case left behind was a reckoning about how missing persons cases are prioritized based on age, background, and perceived profile, about how an entire community can remain unaware of what is happening on a street they pass through every day, about what justice actually means when the person responsible removes himself from the process before it reaches its conclusion, and about what 10 years of endurance, in conditions designed to extinguish every capacity for hope, reveals about the absolute refusal of 3 women to be erased. Amanda knew who she was. Michelle knew who she was. Gina knew who she was. Even when the world had forgotten them, even when one of their names was deleted from a database, even when a decade went by and the coverage moved on, they held on to that knowledge. And on a Monday afternoon in May 2013, because one door was left unlocked and one woman did not hesitate, they came home. But the next person on this list spent 23 years without knowing who she was at all. And when she finally uncovered the truth, she did it entirely on her own. Number 3. Kayla Unbehaun. Kayla Unbehaun was born on January 6, 2008, in Illinois. She grew up in a household shaped by a custody dispute that had moved through the court system and reached a definitive legal resolution. Her father, Sean Unbehaun, held primary custody. Her mother, Heather Unbehaun, had been granted visitation rights. The arrangement was court-ordered, legally binding, and for a period of time, it functioned as intended. On July 4, 2017, 9-year-old Kayla left for a visit with her mother over the Independence Day weekend. It was a routine, court-sanctioned visit. There was no cause for alarm. No warning signs visible enough to warrant concern. Sean said goodbye to his daughter, fully expecting her return within days. She did not come back. Not that weekend, not that month, not for 6 years. Heather Unbehaun had prepared for this. It was not a decision made impulsively in a moment of distress. She had planned it deliberately. She gathered what she needed, removed Kayla from her established life in Illinois, and disappeared into the country quietly and with clear intention. No note was left for Sean. No forwarding address, no phone call, no communication of any kind. She took her daughter and vanished, moving carefully through the United States, staying off the grid, and constructing a new life under the assumption that time and distance would eventually cause the search to lose momentum, fade, and ultimately cease. For 6 years, that strategy came close to succeeding. Sean Unbehaun reported Kayla missing without delay. A federal warrant was issued for Heather's arrest on charges of international parental kidnapping. Kayla's details were entered into the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children database. Her photograph was distributed across missing persons platforms. Law enforcement pursued lead after lead, each one dissolving before it produced anything actionable. Tips arrived and led nowhere. The trail remained cold across state lines as Heather continued moving, continued adjusting their circumstances, and continued ensuring nothing remained stable long enough to be traced. What Sean did during those 6 years is the element of this story that most directly determined its outcome. He did not accept the silence.
He did not allow the case to settle into the background of cold files and forgotten faces. He kept pushing. He kept Kayla's image circulating on every platform available to him. He spoke with anyone willing to listen. He remained visible, stayed persistent. And in 2021, 4 years into the search, he connected with the production team behind Unsolved Mysteries on Netflix. Kayla's case was featured in an episode of the series. Her photograph, her story, the circumstances of her disappearance, all of it presented to millions of viewers across the world. Most people watched. Most people felt something and moved on. The news cycle is relentless, and most faces seen on a screen do not stay with people once they leave the room. But one person's experience was different. In 2023, a viewer in Asheville, North Carolina, was watching that episode when an image of Kayla appeared on screen. Something caused them to stop. Not a vague or dismissible feeling, something specific and immediate. A recognition that carried enough weight to make them pause the episode and sit with what they had just seen. They knew that face, not from a screen, but from their own daily life, from their own community. A teenager living under a different name, presenting no outward signs of anything unusual, whose face matched the image on that screen with enough clarity that the viewer could not set it aside. They made a phone call. That call reached investigators. Law enforcement in Asheville received the tip and treated it with the seriousness it warranted. They located Kayla, by then 15 years old, living in the area with her mother. She was safe. She had not been physically harmed. And 6 years after she had been taken from her father over a July holiday weekend in Illinois, she was on her way home. Heather Unbahan was arrested in Asheville without incident and extradited to Illinois to face charges of aggravated child abduction. In 2023, following a guilty plea, she was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The legal process, measured against the 6 years of searching that had come before it, concluded with relative speed. Kayla's reunion with her father was the moment that 6 years of relentless and exhausting refusal to give up had been building toward. Sean had kept her case alive long enough for a stranger in North Carolina to see her face on a streaming platform and choose to act. Without the Netflix feature, there is no tip. Without the tip, there is no location. Without the location, Kayla does not come home in 2023. Every choice Sean made across those 6 years, every interview, every post, every effort to keep her name in public view, created the conditions for that single moment of recognition to carry the weight it did. What this case asks of everyone who hears it is a question worth genuine reflection. How many cases remain unresolved, not because the answers are unavailable, but because the person holding the answer has not yet connected it to the right question? How many faces have been seen by exactly the right person at exactly the wrong moment? A glance that did not fully register, a name that did not quite connect, a recognition that faded before it could become a phone call. Kayla's case demonstrates that resolution does not always emerge from institutions, forensic advances, databases, or sustained investigative effort. Sometimes it comes from a single individual who happens to be watching something on an ordinary evening and chooses, in one quiet moment, not to look away. That choice, small in the instant and significant in consequence, brought a 6-year disappearance to an end and returned a teenage girl to the father who had never once stopped searching for her. As of 2026, Kayla is 17 years old and living privately with her father in Illinois. No further public updates have been made available, and that privacy is entirely deserving of respect. Heather Unbehaun remains in the Illinois correctional system serving her sentence. Sean Unbehaun, the man who refused to allow his daughter's face to fade from public awareness for 6 consecutive years, received exactly what all of that perseverance was working toward. His daughter came home. And a stranger he will in all likelihood never meet is the reason it happened. But the next case is something altogether different. No database, no streaming documentary, no tip from a community member. The next young woman on this list had been missing for nearly 4 years. And when she finally reappeared, she walked through the front door of a police station entirely on her own, with no explanation that fully satisfied anyone. Number 4. Alex Batty. Alexander Batty was born on September 30th, 2006, in Oldham, Greater Manchester, England. He grew up in a household marked by instability on his mother's side, significant enough that the family courts had intervened and placed legal custody of Alex not with his mother, Melanie Batty, but with his maternal grandmother, Susan Caruana. Susan was the steady presence in his life. She was the person the courts had determined could provide the consistency and security a child requires. She was the one he came home to, and she was the one who would spend 6 years waiting for him to return. Melanie Batty had a history that the courts had evaluated and found insufficient. She held visitation rights, but not custody. That distinction carried enormous weight, legally, practically, and in terms of what followed. Because what followed had been planned in advance. In September 2017, 10-year-old Alex departed the United Kingdom with his mother Melanie and his maternal grandfather David Batty, under the description of a holiday in Spain. A routine family trip. A temporary absence. Nothing about the way it was framed suggested anything beyond a brief period away and an anticipated return. Susan Caruana said goodbye to her grandson with no reason, in that moment, to believe it would be the last time she would see him for 6 years. It was not a holiday. Melanie and David had no intention of ever bringing Alex back. Rather than returning to Oldham after a week or two abroad, they took Alex across Europe, through Spain, into France, and across to Morocco, moving between communities that had consciously rejected conventional society in favor of what they described as a spiritual, self-sufficient way of life. Off-grid communes, transient settlements, groups of people who shared a philosophy of withdrawal from the systems that structure ordinary existence. No fixed address, no formal schooling, no paper trail, no meaningful contact with the outside world beyond what the community itself provided. No phone calls to Susan, no letters, no acknowledgement that a grandmother in Oldham was waiting, searching, and not resting easily at night. Susan Caruana reported Alex missing as soon as it became apparent the family was not returning. UK authorities issued alerts and opened the case. But tracking a child being deliberately moved through multiple European countries by adults committed to leaving no trace is an entirely different category of challenge from a standard domestic missing persons investigation. There are border crossings, jurisdictional gaps, language barriers, and the fundamental difficulty of searching for people who are actively building their lives around remaining undetectable. The trail went cold across borders and stayed cold. For 6 years, Alex lived that life. He was 11 years old when it began. A child with no meaningful input into what was happening, surrounded by adults who had made a decision about how his existence would be structured and who were not seeking his participation or consent. The lifestyle was presented by those adults as freedom,
as liberation from the constraints of conventional society, from school systems, government records, and the ordinary rhythms of a settled life in England. But there is a particular injustice in presenting a child with a form of confinement and labeling it freedom. Because when you are 11 years old, and the adults controlling your circumstances have decided where you will go and how you will live, genuine choice is simply not available to you, regardless of how the arrangement is philosophically described. He received no formal schooling. He had no consistent home address. He moved between communities in France and Morocco, living in ways that left no digital footprint, no records, no trail that investigators could track. Susan continued searching. UK authorities kept the case active, but the years accumulated and Alex remained gone, growing from an 11-year-old boy into a teenager that no one in England had ever seen. Then, in December 2023, something shifted within him. A driver in the Haute-Garonne region of southern France, a rural stretch of winding roads and dispersed communities, was traveling along a quiet country road when a teenage boy came into view. He was alone. He was on foot. He appeared to have been walking for some time. The driver slowed and came to a stop. The boy approached the vehicle calmly. He spoke. He explained, clearly and without confusion, that he had been living off the grid with his family, that he had reached a point where he wanted something different, something ordinary, and that he needed assistance getting home. He gave his name as Alex Batty. The driver contacted French authorities immediately. Police verified his identity against missing persons records and notified UK law enforcement. Within days, Alex Batty was back in England for the first time in 6 years, reunited with his grandmother Susan, the woman who had never once accepted his absence as permanent and had never stopped waiting for the moment she could hold him again. He was 17 years old. He had been 11 when he left. 6 years of growing up had unfolded in communes and off-grid communities across 2 continents, in the absence of formal education, without the ordinary structure of a conventional childhood. In almost every measurable sense, he was a fundamentally different person from the boy who had boarded a flight to Spain with his mother and grandfather 6 years earlier. His account of those years was detailed, considered, and, in many respects, deeply unusual. He described moving between spiritual communities in France and Morocco. He discussed the philosophy that governed those communities with a measured detachment, neither entirely condemning it nor embracing it, but clearly having arrived at a point where it was no longer aligned with the life he wanted. He had taught himself French during those years. He had pursued informal self-education, constructing his own internal understanding of the world entirely outside any conventional framework. He spoke to journalists and gave interviews with a clarity and composure that caught many people off guard. He also described what that life had genuinely meant to live: the isolation, the deliberate severance from everything familiar, the absence of any real agency over the direction of his own existence, and the moment, or the accumulation of moments, at which he had concluded that what the adults around him called freedom was not the life he intended to lead. He was 17. He had access to a road and a stranger who chose to stop. So he walked toward that stranger and asked for help. Melanie Batty was subsequently located in France. Legal proceedings were initiated against her, raising significant questions about cross-border jurisdiction, the enforceability of UK custody arrangements across EU member states, and the practical challenge of holding a parent legally accountable when they have spent years moving deliberately between multiple countries with no fixed address and no recoverable paper trail. David Batty had died during the years Alex was away. Alex's reintegration into life in England was gradual. By his own account, he approached it with curiosity rather than resentment, which says something considerable about the kind of person 6 years of an unconventional and fundamentally unchosen existence had shaped him into. He was rebuilding. Susan was present. The bond between a grandmother and her grandson, stretched across 6 years and multiple countries, had held. What was taken from him during those years is real, and cannot be diminished. 6 years of formal education. 6 years of the ordinary stability of a childhood. 6 years of being a boy in Oldham, with the unremarkable, continuous rhythms of a life simply unfolding. Those years are gone, and they do not return. But he came back, and on a rural road in southern France in December 2023, he came back entirely on his own terms, by walking toward a stranger and asking for what he needed. As of 2026, Alex is 19 years old and living privately in England. He has spoken openly about his experiences and has demonstrated a willingness to engage with his own story with a degree of honesty and self-awareness that goes well beyond what most people would expect from someone who endured what he did. Susan Caruana, the grandmother who held legal custody and never surrendered hope, has her grandson home. 6 years, multiple countries. One teenage boy who decided he had reached his limit walked to a road and flagged down a car. But the final 2 cases in this collection close the story in the most powerful way possible. One was resolved by a young woman who found herself in a photograph. The other by a father who spent 32 years and more than 100,000 flyers refusing to allow his son to become just another name lost in a database. Number 5. Alicia Navarro. Alicia Navarro was born on January 4, 2005, in Glendale, Arizona. She grew up in a household shaped by the particular rhythms of a family managing the daily realities of raising a child with autism. Her mother, Jessica Nunez, described her as bright and naturally curious, a girl who engaged deeply with information, who carried a rich internal world that she navigated with intelligence and sensitivity, but who found face-to-face social interaction genuinely challenging in ways that most people around her did not fully appreciate. What came effortlessly to most teenagers, the hallway exchanges, the casual conversations, the unspoken social patterns of adolescence, required a level of effort from Alicia that others simply did not have to consider. What did come naturally was the internet. Online, Alicia communicated with a fluency she could not always access in person. She spent considerable time connecting through screens, building relationships, sustaining conversations, occupying digital spaces where the dynamics of interaction were different and where she felt, by most accounts, more fully at ease. For a teenager with autism in the mid-2010s, this was far from uncommon. For Alicia specifically, it was the primary means through which she engaged with the social world around her. On the night of September 15, 2019, 14-year-old Alicia Navarro left her home in Glendale. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, no indication that anyone had entered from outside and taken her against her will. What there was a note, brief, handwritten, left for her mother. It told Jessica not to worry. It said she would be back. Then she walked out of the house and disappeared. No confirmed sightings emerged in the immediate aftermath. No digital trail led investigators to any conclusion they could act on with certainty. No witnesses could place her beyond the immediate neighborhood. The circumstances surrounding her departure, the note, the absence of any indication of a struggle, the apparent suggestion that she had left of her own accord, made this case considerably more complex than a straightforward abduction. But a 14-year-old girl with autism, leaving her home alone in the middle of the night, poses questions that a handwritten note cannot begin to address. The note offered no information about where she was going, who she may have been going to meet, or what had brought her to that decision at that precise moment. Investigators pursued every available lead. Tips arrived from across the country and dissolved without producing anything useful. Digital forensics were carried out. Online connections were examined and analyzed. The case drew national attention in its opening weeks, with Alicia's face appearing across news platforms and missing persons networks. And then, as most cases eventually do, regardless of how they begin, it receded from the headlines. Not because it had been resolved, because the news cycle moved forward and made space for the next story. Jessica Nunez did not move forward. What Alicia's mother did during the nearly 4 years her daughter was gone is one of the most defining aspects of this entire case. She became a persistent, consistent, and tireless public presence on her daughter's behalf. She gave interviews when she had nothing new to report. She sustained visibility across social media platforms. She spoke about Alicia continuously and specifically, not as an abstraction in a missing persons database, but as a real girl with a real personality, real interests, and a real inner life that deserved to remain present in the public consciousness as fully as it remained present in the memory of her family. She understood, with a clarity born from desperation, that sustained public attention was the only resource she had. She used it deliberately, and she never stopped. For 1,400 days, there was nothing. No confirmed sightings, no credible leads that held up under scrutiny, no contact of any kind, no indication of whether Alicia was alive or gone, safe or in danger, still in Arizona or somewhere entirely different.
1,400 days of a mother waking each morning with the same unanswered question and ending each night without an answer. Then, on July 27, 2023, a young woman walked into a police station in Havre, Montana, a small city in the northern part of the state, roughly 1,400 miles from Glendale, Arizona. She was 18 years old. She sat down with officers and identified herself as Alicia Navarro. After nearly 4 years of complete silence, she had reappeared, alive, physically unharmed. She had come forward entirely on her own terms at a time of her own choosing and presented herself to law enforcement without any external pressure that the public was made aware of. The response was immediate. Relief moved through the law enforcement community that had worked the case. Jessica Nunez was notified. The news traveled quickly across the missing persons networks that had carried Alicia's name for 4 years. But alongside that relief came a flood of questions. From investigators, from the public, from everyone who had followed the case, that the initial confirmation of her safety did nothing to resolve. Where had she been? Who had she been with during those 4 years? Had she left her home in Glendale voluntarily that night in September 2019, or had someone manipulated her into walking out that door? Had the online connections she maintained in the period before her disappearance contributed to what occurred? Had crimes been committed against her during the time she was gone? The note she left had implied she departed of her own will, but a 14-year-old girl with autism leaving in the middle of the night raises questions that extend well beyond the word voluntary. Vulnerability is not always outwardly visible. Manipulation does not always leave discernible marks, and the online world through which Alicia moved so naturally before her disappearance is an environment where individuals with predatory intentions have learned, with considerable sophistication, to establish trust with young people who seek connection and find it more accessible through a screen than through direct interaction. Law enforcement confirmed she was safe. They confirmed that the investigation into the full circumstances of her disappearance remained active. Beyond that, details were held closely, partly to protect Alicia herself during what was clearly an extraordinarily sensitive period, and partly because the ongoing investigation made public disclosure a risk.
What emerged gradually, through carefully managed statements and subsequent reporting, was a picture of a young woman who had been living largely off the grid across those 4 years, moving through different states, connected to individuals she had encountered online in the period preceding her departure. The complete picture of what occurred during those 1,400 days, who was involved, under what conditions she lived, whether crimes were committed against her, And what the precise circumstances of her departure in 2019 actually were remains, as of 2026, the subject of an active investigation. Not everything has been disclosed to the public. Some details may never be. The investigation has identified at least one individual of interest, and federal authorities have been engaged in examining the online connections that preceded her disappearance. But a full public account of those 4 years does not yet exist. What Jessica Nunez experienced when she received that phone call is something that words can approach but not fully capture. Nearly 4 years of not knowing, of searching with every means available to her, of keeping her daughter's name in the public conversation through sheer and sustained refusal to accept silence. And then a call from a police station in Montana, telling her that Alicia was sitting across from an officer and that she was alive. Nearly 4 years of uncertainty collapsed into a single moment of finally knowing. Alicia was 18 years old when she walked into that police station. She had been 14 when she left. 4 years of whatever had taken place passed in between. Whatever those years contained, whatever was done to her, whatever choices were made, whatever she endured, whatever combination of circumstances and other people's actions shaped that period, belongs to her to process, to understand, and eventually, if she chooses, to share, on her own terms and no one else's. She came back. That part is not in question. She walked into a police station in a city 1,400 miles from home and told them who she was. Everything beyond that remains unfolding, still being investigated, still being processed, still being lived through by a young woman who is now navigating the long and non-linear reality of what comes after. As of 2026, Alicia is 21 years old and living privately. Jessica Nunez has spoken publicly about her daughter's return with a depth of gratitude that reflects what 4 years of not knowing genuinely feels like from the inside. The investigation continues. The unanswered questions are real, and they carry weight. But the question that mattered most, the one Jessica carried with her every single morning for 1,400 days, was answered on a July afternoon in Montana. Her daughter was alive. But the next case involves a boy who did something remarkably similar, except he did not walk into a police station. He walked up to a complete stranger on a rural road in France, after years of living off the grid across multiple countries, and said simply, "I need help getting home." Number 6. Mao Yin. Mao Yin was born in 1988 in Xi'an, Shanxi Province, China. He was 2 years old, barely old enough to form lasting memories, barely old enough to make sense of the world around him, when he was taken. His father, Li Jingju, was 26 years old at the time. They were a young family in a city of millions, living an ordinary life. And then, in the span of a single afternoon, everything that life was built upon was gone. On a day in 1988, Li Jingju stepped away briefly from outside a hotel to help a neighbor move furniture. It was the kind of small, unremarkable act of kindness that people carry out without a second thought, the sort of errand that takes minutes and registers as nothing. Mao Yin was there when he left. When he returned, his son was gone. In the time it takes to carry furniture up a flight of stairs, a child had vanished. Li reported it immediately. Police opened an investigation. But child trafficking in China during that period was not an isolated problem confined to rare incidents. It was a widespread and deeply embedded criminal system. Children were taken and transported with speed and coordination,
moved across vast distances, sold to families in remote provinces who either did not ask questions or preferred not to. The networks were organized. The country was immense. The investigative capacity required to trace a single child across a nation of over 1 billion people was nowhere near adequate for the scale of what was occurring. The trail went cold within weeks. What Li Jingzhi chose to do next is the part of this story that is almost impossible to fully absorb. He did not stop. Not in the way that most people, even the most devoted and determined of parents, must eventually stop in order to continue functioning. He did not slow down. He did not arrive at a point of acceptance or worn-down resignation. He left his job. He dedicated his life, not as a figure of speech intended to convey commitment, but literally, entirely, and at profound personal cost, to locating his son. Over the next 32 years, Li Jingzhi distributed more than 100,000 flyers across China.
100,000 pieces of paper, each carrying his son's face and the details of his disappearance, handed to strangers in cities, towns, and provinces he had never visited before and might never see again. He traveled to parts of the country with no obvious connection to his case, pursuing rumors that dissolved and following leads that led nowhere. Showing Mao Yin's photograph to people who had never encountered the name. He attended missing children conferences and formed connections with other parents living in the same impossible space between searching and grieving. Parents who understood what it meant to carry an absence that the rest of the world had largely moved past. He used every platform available to him. As technology developed, he adapted alongside it. When age progression software became accessible, he used it to generate images of what Mao Yin might look like as a teenager, then as a young adult, then as a man in his 30s. He shared those images wherever he could, online, within communities, on platforms that extended further than printed flyers ever could. He did not remarry for years. His entire existence restructured itself around a single purpose, not as a temporary phase, not as something carried out alongside an otherwise normal life, as the thing his life had become. 32 years. Every morning, choosing again to continue. Every lead that dissolved into nothing. Every year that passed without resolution. Every moment of uncertainty about whether his son was alive, whether he was well, whether he had any awareness that somewhere across China, a father had surrendered everything in pursuit of him. 32 years of that same choice, renewed every single day. In 2021, the Chinese government launched a nationwide initiative using facial recognition technology to identify missing children and reconnect families separated through trafficking and abduction. The program cross-referenced facial data gathered across the country against decades of accumulated missing persons records. It represented exactly the kind of technological capability that had not existed when Mao Yin was taken in 1988. The kind that fundamentally changes what is possible in cases that were once considered permanently beyond resolution. The program found Mao Yin. He was living in Sichuan province, more than 1,000 kilometers from Xi'an, under a different name, Sun Zhuo. He was 33 years old. He had been raised by a family who had purchased him as an infant, and he had grown up with no knowledge of his biological origins, no memory of Xi'an, and no awareness of a father who had spent 3 decades searching for him. He had built a life, a profession, relationships, an identity, a sense of self, entirely separate from the one that had been taken from him before he was old enough to retain a single conscious memory of it. When investigators made contact and explained what the facial recognition system had flagged, DNA testing was carried out.
The results were unambiguous. He was Mao Yin. The reunion between Li Jingzhe and his son was broadcast across China and covered by international media. It stood as one of the most significant missing child recoveries in the country's modern history, not solely because of the outcome, but because of what it represented. 32 years of one man's absolute refusal to accept that his son was permanently gone, confirmed in a single moment. A father and a son, separated when the boy was 2 years old, in the same room together for the first time across 3 decades. The man who had distributed 100,000 flyers across an entire nation, finally meeting the face that had appeared on every one of them. The individual who had taken and sold Mao Yin as an infant was identified through the investigation and brought to justice. Unlike a number of the cases that precede this one, cases where statutes of limitations had expired, where those responsible had died, where legal accountability was simply no longer available, in this instance, justice was achievable, and it was pursued. For Li Jingzhe, the reunion represented everything 32 years of searching had been directed toward. And it was also, in ways that are quietly complicated, the beginning of something new and uncertain. Because the son who came back was not the 2-year-old boy who had been taken from outside that hotel. He was a 33-year-old man with his own life, his own formed memories, his own deeply rooted sense of who he was. He was, in almost every meaningful way, a stranger. One who shared Li's DNA and carried Li's loss without ever having known it existed. Rebuilding a connection across 32 years of absence is not something that happens in a reunion broadcast on national television. It is a gradual and uncertain process, built carefully on the foundation of a bond that endured only because one man refused, every single day across 3 decades, to allow it to disappear. Mao Yin's case is among the most compelling arguments for persistence. Not hope as a passive emotional state, not hope as something that merely sustains a person in the absence of action, but hope as a daily, deliberate, and exhausting choice, made over 3 decades by a man who had every reason to stop, and elected, each morning, not to. Li Jingzhe made that choice 11,680 times.
And on one afternoon in 2021, it was enough.
6 children, 6 disappearances, 6 outcomes that nobody predicted and everyone needed. Look at what brought them home. A DNA database, a Netflix viewer who paid attention, a second crime that exposed the first, a young woman who searched a database and found her own face, a teenager who walked up to a stranger on a rural road, a father who spent 32 years and over 100,000 flyers refusing to accept silence as a final answer. And that is why these stories matter. Not just as crime cases, but as evidence of something stubborn and human that refuses to let absence become permanent. If this video moved you, subscribe, because there are more stories like these, and they deserve to be told. Every case we cover is real, every name matters, and every person who watches, shares, and stays until the end makes this channel possible. Thank you for being here.